Bruce Lincoln has studied myth and its role in community building or destruction, and has a very interesting take on the evolution of myth and how leaders can use myth to motivate people to do things that are both for good or evil. Along those lines, Bruce Lincoln has written a few books on myth and mythology that are worth noting. The first, from 1989, casts myth as a form of discourse. It's called Discourse and the Construction of Society, Comparative Studies of Myth. Another very interesting book of his from 1999 looks at how myth can be used even to commit genocide. This book is called Theorizing Myth, Narrative, Ideology, and Scholarship. I'll be drawing from these to talk about Lincoln's perspectives on myth. Bruce Lincoln calls myth a second-order semiotic system, or a meta-language. Symbols and signs are extracted from history in their original context. They're recast for new meaning. Myths justify historical events by lifting their significance. Myths can even make the temporary state seem eternal. It is in this way, by creating a mythic story, that pharaohs and kings become chosen ones by the gods. And so myth can be manipulative, hegemonic, and a form of psyops mind control. This makes myth then the most ideological form of speech, where myths reinforce the existing social structures and prove the special nature of our group over other groups. Lincoln further discusses how discourse elicits emotion. He states that for a disruptive discourse to take hold, one must be able to promote it or propagate it. So it must be persuasive, then, to evoke the emotion, the sentiment pre-existing in the hearer. But the disruptiveness is dependent upon the disruptor's ability to persuade. So the discourse must call forth a group of followers, which depends on evoking the right emotions out of which change and new social formation can occur. This discourse utilizes ideological persuasion and sentiment evocation to bring about social construction. Lincoln asserts that the most important element holding a society together or destroying it is sentiment, which is chiefly a sense of belonging or rejection. And, quoting Lincoln, mythic discourse is the chief instrument with which such sentiment may be aroused, manipulated, and rendered dormant. As a mode of discourse, myth invokes an ancestral memories and symbols that can also be formed into revolutionary slogans. Remember the Alamo is one such slogan. Its power is in its recognition by a group and its ability to convince the anger necessary to evoke the actions that must come from its invocation. It establishes expected behaviors based on the invocation and establishes the expectations of the person hearing the slogan as a call to fight. So myths are there to establish and maintain the social structures and enable the proper understanding that it reinforces current structures, which in these examples, you should be willing to die for. What other mythic slogans can you think of? When one reduces myth to lies, one reveals how one is superior to the social group that believes in such primitive thoughts as these myths and these false stories. But myth is so much more. Lincoln, in his Theorizing Myth book, discusses the evolution of the term myth in depth, talking about how Plato and the early Christian fathers replaced the term mythos with logos, where the shift to human reason as truth in logos became the higher form of thinking, and rational logic led to scientific revolutions. Yet the mythic stories that continued to operate during those times continued to reinforce the new social structures, where the king is anointed by the Pope and therefore certified as the chosen one of God. Finally, Lincoln describes myth as that small class of stories possessing credibility and authority that serve as paradigmatic truth, yielding revolutionary slogans and ancestral invocations to reinforce the status quo or mobilize a social grouping to self-sacrifice. This is a good definition of myth to take forward, perhaps, because evoking ancestral slogans evokes feelings that are predictive of certain behaviors, such as aggression or peaceful passivity, which are actively reinforced in the stories behind those slogans. One merely needs to say the name, and the story is conjured among those who belong. Common mythic images still evoked today are the story of David, David and Goliath, Samson. In other mythologies, Osiris in Egypt or Zeus in Greece. They're all called upon as ancestral invocations. Each of these names are slogans. They can be called on to remind us of our special understanding of how we fit in history and within our group, because we all know the story and what needs to be done when someone reminds us of the story. In telling a mythic story, one can maintain the social structures. The pharaoh is a descendant of Ra and therefore must be worshipped. So let's build him a pyramid. But Lincoln also points out that myths can also be used to change society. There are a few strategies that leaders use to recast myth for their own purposes. They often reduce myth to the lies category, giving the stories no credence, making them ridiculous and unbelievable, like with the pharaohs, who are just men. They're not gods because they die like men. Or leaders can take a commonly known story, a legend or fable, and raise its significance, providing the story with a new, higher credibility and authority. Well, yes, the pharaohs are just men, but they are still chosen by the gods to rule. Therefore, we create a new structure. Or when overthrowing a pharaoh god, we have a divinely chosen king or prophet to replace the pharaoh. Lastly, one can take an old myth and cast it for one's own purposes by altering our understanding of what it really means or what it means for us today. Leaders use all of these strategies to inspire, manipulate, or hegemonize. We've seen world leaders recently use the slogan of fake news to cast themselves as unique purveyors of truth to their followers. It's a common strategy, one where true and false are rarely represented as such. It's not even a relevant question. While some more traditional approaches to myth cast them as the folly of the ruling class in subjugating the lower classes, Lincoln lifts myth to influential discourse that can be used by leaders to refashion society, providing new revolutionary slogans and myths to move history forward. Some leaders use it to kill, as did Cortez in co-opting the myths of the Aztecs to reinforce the inevitability of his victory over them, or as did Hitler, using Herder's reinterpretation of a special Volk, or Nietzsche's image of the Übermensch, and casting that as the German Aryan manifest destiny to rule the world as the social Darwinian inheritors of superior genes and societal organization. I would recommend using myths to do good, and only good though, if you ever get the chance to lead. So myth for Lincoln is the most ideological form of speech, a mode of discourse like ancestral invocations and revolutionary slogans, and possessing both credibility and authority. Often because it is a good story about us that makes us us and not them. Joseph Campbell gives us a sense of danger of being the purveyor of myth. If the visionary leader or seer does not act in dialogue with the community and prophesies something that the community doesn't want to hear or is not ready to hear, they will wipe him out. And you need look no further than the Bible as source material for the truth of that view. So if you are willing to co-opt myths for your own ends, use caution. Leaders are celebrated one moment for their vision and hanged the next. Sometimes those leaders themselves are later raised to legends than myths, but in modern day society, I wouldn't bet on it. In the next presentation, I'll summarize the definitions of myth so that we can move on to discussing other things.